Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back on another video from Annie News, and we've got more cut content for Overlord. Can't wait for Season 4, but yeah, let's see what else was cut out or changed in Season 1 of Overlord, shall we? Can't wait to see.
Last cut content, we talked a whole lot about Nazarick and its floor guardians. This skipped details behind the hierarchy of power, along with the general information attributed to its logistics. Where that brings us to in episode 3 is the very first conflict that we see Ainz take part in. A completely one-sided battle that introduces us to
so cool. Nature. It's just like, whoa, he's so over
We're not
the
just
top.
shown his brief thoughts on certain incidents, but instead given a proper explanation for each and every one of the actions he takes.
Okay.
So, if you've ever wanted an in-depth look into Ainz's thought process, then that's exactly what you're going to get here.
Awesome.
That and all the extra action that was left out from when he saved Carne Village. Episode 3, the Battle of Carne Village.
Sure.
Covering chapters 3 and 4 from volume 1 of the light novel.
Okay.
What we see Momonga using here right at the beginning is a useful item known as the Mirror of Remote Viewing. A tool that many player killers or player killers would use to scout for targets back in Ainz.
Okay, cool.
Unlike in the New World, though. The anti-intelligence magic that many players would use to conceal themselves often made this item far less useful than it was right now.
Okay.
Especially since it was also vulnerable to counterattacks from reactive barriers. But for Momonga to be able to scout the outside area without any threat to himself right now, well, that was reason enough for him to try and make use of it here.
Definitely.
He needed to confirm whether he was still in their homeworld of Helheim or not.
Okay, makes sense.
What he saw instead of the despair-filled landscape that he was used to was nothing more than grassy plains which seemed to spread for miles. Momonga would spend hours figuring out the mechanics of this mirror, all while failing to find any sentient life whatsoever. Plus, to make things even more awkward, Momonga couldn't help but feel uncomfortable by the constant presence of Sebas. Not just because he was his designated escort, but also because it constantly reminded him of Touch Me. Specifically the fact that both were extremely scary when they became angry. Now, an interesting thing to note about NPCs like Sebas is that, ever since the retainment of sentience, each would use video game expressions as if they were normal. Terms like skills, class, and level were used in the very same context they would be in Yggdrasil.
Right.
Like when Momonga had offered Sebas the opportunity for a break, Sebas instead responded that he possessed an item which made physical fatigue impossible.
Wow, okay. Ain't that cool?
Familiar with these terms, it made it a lot easier for Momonga to order them around using them. In any case, it was after having mastered the control of the mirror that Momonga decided he would teach Demiurge how to use it as well.
Interesting.
That way he could then apply them as the foundation for Nazarick's security system.
Security, yeah, makes sense. That makes so sense.
That I had mentioned in the previous episode. Now, it was after Momonga had spotted the village that his first thoughts were of how it held no value to him. Sure, he would have saved them if they had some important information to share, but it was rather clear that these were all nothing more than common folk. It was as soon as he'd come to that conclusion, though, that Momonga immediately realized he was different now.
Whoa.
Emotions he knew he would have felt like pity, anger, or unease were now just completely gone. To him, what he was watching looked no different than wild animals displaying survival of the fittest.
Wow, right,
it was a thought that seemed to indicate he was already considering humans as a different species. So, out of the fear that this could in fact be true, Momonga quickly began to justify it with excuses. He felt he couldn't just charge in and save everyone, since there could very well be a valid reason for their mass execution. Then, even if there wasn't, his very interference could make enemies with the country these soldiers served. So, it was very obvious the safe option was to just stay back and do nothing. What eventually
losing his humanity
was the very peculiar actions of Henry's father. You see, although it wasn't fully explained in the anime, I'm sure you could tell that it seemed as if this man had made eye contact.
Yeah.
That definitely wasn't possible without the anti-intelligence magic I had mentioned earlier, but even so, Henry's father still looked directly at him. He had made eye contact, then asked for his daughters to be saved.
Damn.
Almost like he was asking Momonga personally. This still wasn't enough to force Momonga into action, but it did make him remember Touch Me's tendencies to help people. A debt he felt he owed since Touch Me's intervention actually saved him from quitting Yggdrasil altogether. Had Touch Me not prevented the constant PK of Momonga's character, then Ainz, Gauntlets, and Nazarick wouldn't exist today.
It's all right, okay,
That's just how important Touch Me was to everything. Now, a quick thing to mention about the gate spell used to get to Carne is that this was Yggdrasil's most reliable teleportation spell. Not only was its range practically infinite, but its failure rate was a confirmed 0%. It was by far the easiest and most stable.
Ain't that sick?
Ensuring Momonga could arrive
anywhere,
right on time to
anywhere.
To add a bit more action to this scene, though, it was prior to Momonga's arrival that Henry would do everything she could attempt to attack the knight that was pursuing her. Mere moments before the knight was about to cut her down, she had actually moved faster than his sword and punched it right in the helmet.
Oh, cool.
It was an attack fueled by all the anger and rage she'd kept bottled up inside her. A strike she'd put her entire body and soul into. Despite the impact having broken her hand, though,
Ooh, yeah.
managed to buy
Damn,
Nemu a
at least she
few more
tried.
seconds. This single punch had actually sent the knight staggering backwards,
Whoa.
giving Momonga enough time to finally show up.
Hey, that's cool.
Even if he didn't, though, Henry was ready to lay down her life for Nemu here,
Aw.
much to the point that she was even willing to use her flesh to do so. If her own body was the only tool left to prevent the sword from reaching her sister, then Henry was ready to make sure the sword
Whoa.
would stay stuck there. She was prepared to push the sword so deep into her flesh that the knight would have no chance of getting it back until she was dead.
Whoa.
Fortunately, it didn't have to come to that, since the very presence of Momonga halted the knights right where they were standing.
Whoa.
It was a brief moment of fear followed by the 9th tier spell Grasp Heart.
Grasp
A wise
Heart.
choice that covered multiple outcomes just in case the worst happened. What I mean is that Momonga didn't just choose Grasp Heart for its instant death, but also because in the off chance the knights could resist it, then its secondary stun effect would allow Momonga to grab the girls and jump through the gate.
Ah, right, okay,
This was
cool.
him implementing his motto of always having a plan B and evacuate.
So he wasn't 100% sure whether it would work or not,
Even when
right,
he had switched
okay.
his focus to the second knight, Momonga still planned to follow up with a second attack. He truly believed a spell as weak as Dragon Lightning wouldn't be able to one-shot him. But when that's exactly what happened, the knight's apparent weakness went to shock even him.
Ah,
You see, ever since he'd become level 100, Momonga had become accustomed to using only spells in the 8th tier or above. So, for this knight to drop at a mere 5th tier spell, well, that just meant that he'd been worrying for nothing.
wow, yeah.
Of course, he did still consider the possibility that he hit for a crit or just faced 2 incredibly weak enemies, but that was something it was no longer possible to even be nervous about. Instead, he could only approach every situation with increased levels of caution. That said, Momonga decided to continue his tests with Create Undead next, this time bringing forth a low-level monster that was practically useless to him. With a level
Wow,
that
so it was just like,
5,
he
this
just
undead
little
knight was
experiments
only
with
good
his
for
attacks and that.
It was Momonga's favorite tank due to its 2 special abilities. The first was its ability to take all aggro, and the other was the
Cool.
ability to withstand any attack once. No matter how strong or powerful an
Whoa,
attack was,
so it's like
this
just
undead
a
knight
shield.
would always be able to survive it with 1 health remaining, making it a useful shield for tanking
Yeah.
just about anything.
Whoa.
Now, a major thing Momonga had noticed about how these monsters acted was that they no longer needed to stand near its summoner anymore. Normally, the creature would just hover around where it was summoned, but this one instead took its order then ran away to fulfill it.
Cool.
It was a significantly increased level of freedom in comparison to Yggdrasil, another unknown of this new world that Momonga felt could prove fatal. It was after this and Albedo's appearance that Ainz would then proceed to try and help Henry. The thing is, his initial attempt to get close had only made the 2 of them wet themselves.
Oh no!
So,
I mean, you
while
would. If
trying
you've
to
seen
do
that
his
skeleton dude
Momonga
walking over
decided
to you, you would be a bit like, oh my god!
The haversack, which could store any combination of items up to a max weight of 1,000 pounds. As for the item he chose, well, this was nothing more than a minor red potion which healed for 50 HP back in Yggdrasil. A potion that used Justice energy to heal, which meant that it was actually poisonous to Momonga.
Oh.
The only reason he'd kept it in his inventory at all was because not all his guildmates were undead like him. So, even though this potion may do damage to him,
It could help someone
could
else.
possibly come in handy to heal others.
Right.
Now, to quickly explain what these 2 barriers did, the first prevented any living things from passing through it,
Oh.
while the second weakened all types of projectile
Cool.
attacks, both of which would have been perfected with a final application of an anti-magic spell. Because he didn't know the types of magic that existed in this world, though, Momonga instead chose not to. His final gift was instead an artifact, items with fixed sets of data that couldn't be augmented. If you remember how I mentioned before, almost everything in Yggdrasil could be customized with data crystals, thus the reason why it was such a popular game in the first place. Any item that couldn't be customized was instead referred to as an artifact, one of which was the Goblin General's horn we see here.
Okay.
So, should Henry choose to use this horn, then 12 permanent goblin summons would appear before her, all of which would only disappear after having been killed. And that's the last key thing worth noting before Momonga would identify himself as Ainz.
Cool.
If we switch over to the scene with the Death Knight now, the commander we see cowering in fear here was actually explained to be the person who killed Henry's father.
Oh.
According to the knights who were with him, it was after having chased the girls across the village that Henry's father would confront him and hold him back. Being a knight that wasn't skilled on his own, though, The commander had no choice but to call for help, resulting in the other knights coming to split the two of them apart. Then, as soon as the commander was free, he had taken his rage out on the father by stabbing him
Oh, God.
So, for him to die the way that he did, well, that was just an extremely fitting end to a very scummy character.
Yeah, fair dude.
Now, the Squire zombie who had grabbed his leg right before was actually a result of the Death Knight's passive. You see, whenever the Death Knight kills a target, an undead with the same level would spawn in its place.
Oh.
Making this a useful ability that did well to expand the size of Ainz's
Holy crap, yeah.
That said, the fact this level 35 Death Knight was still running around causing havoc only went to further prove just how weak everyone was. Like, when compared to his other summons like the Grim Reaper Thanatos or the Overlord Wiseman, the Death Knight would be nothing more than a typical mob. The reason why he's hesitant to use those, though, is that summons of that nature require experience instead of magic. Experience Ainz wasn't sure he'd get back if he happened to use it. Fast forward a bit to Ainz's introduction, and the first thing we get to is an explanation of the mask we see him wearing. This was an event item called the Mask of Jealousy.
The Jealousy
Mask,
right.
Not because of what it can do, but instead because of what it represents.
What does it
I mean is
represent?
that the only way a player could obtain this item was by being in-game for 2+ hours on Christmas Eve between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m.
Oh!
As soon as those conditions were met, the item was then forcibly added to the player's inventory,
Whoa.
making it a permanent cosmetic gifted to all the owners. Thus the reason many considered it to be a curse.
Oh.
As for the gauntlets Ainz wore to cover his hands, these were nothing more than crafted items which boosted the wearer's strength. Typical iron gauntlets
That's
that you could
cool thing about the mask.
Now, it was during the time that Ainz was at the village leader's house that he was very careful with how he was going to gather information. Reason being that revealing too much about his lack of knowledge could definitely be a weakness that was used against him. Sure, it may not have an impact with a village like this, but when interacting with people who carried more authority, there was no telling how they would eventually plan to use that vital information against
him. Yeah.
Plus, because Henry showed fear of his undead nature, it was only natural to assume that humans would come to condemn him. That's why he felt the need to keep almost everything about himself completely hidden.
Makes sense.
That said, Ainz did know that he could always use magic to get the information he wanted, but after using memory manipulation on the two sisters, he felt it was best to save some of his magic points. You see, even overwriting just a couple minutes from both of the girls' memories had used significantly more magic points than he was willing to part with.
Oh, right.
Much to the point that he could feel its depletion all the way to his core. So, with only his experience as a businessman to guide him through this conversation, Ainz was able to elegantly shift the conversation from one of compensation all the way to one of information. Well, more like he was lucky enough to spot the opening he could use to shift it that way. It was after having determined his gold coins were worth double the amount of the standard that the village leader knew he wouldn't be able to properly pay him. So, as the leader began to bargain for a lower price, Ainz offered to take information instead. You see, because Ainz had portrayed himself as this caster who had been holed up in a place called Nazarick, there was no skepticism to be had towards his sudden inquiry for knowledge. He had made them believe they were making a completely fair trade with him, resulting in the perfect transition into what Ainz really wanted. So, as soon as it was confirmed that he'd been transported to a different world, Ainz began to operate under the assumption that he couldn't have been the only player to be transported here.
Yeah,
If there were a larger group of Japanese
wondering, isn't he, if there are other members out there of his
Ainz
group.
wanted nothing more than to join up with them. He knew it was likely the best course of action. The only problem with that, though, was that many players viewed his guild as the enemy. You see, the guild of Ainzul Gon often role-played as this evil organization, one that would always do plenty of player killing. That being the case, he wasn't sure the hatred towards his guild would have died down by now.
Yeah.
So, in order to avoid any potential conflict with other players, Ainz felt it was best to make as few enemies as possible, a task he knew would require procedure. If he was going to venture out into the outside world, then Ainz knew from now on any action would require justification. He couldn't just go and slaughter.
Yeah, imagine if like a player actually turns up and
other
just as
players
strong as
who still
him,
had
and then
the
yeah,
divinity
that's
would
crazy.
most definitely look down on it. Should there come a time where he did have to face off against other players, though, then the best Nazarick could do was hold off 30 level 100s. Combine this with the effects of a world item he currently had stored away, then Nazarick would become this impregnable fortress. The main reason he couldn't rely solely on that, though, was because every time this world item would be cast, the cost of using it was Ainz's level. Meaning that if a raid was launched with multiple waves of backup, Nazarick and Ainz would eventually be worn down to the point where the world item was useless. Of course, all this focus on warfare was a very narrow point of view, but Ainz wasn't so naive as to not consider the worst possible outcome. Everything he was thinking about now was him just accounting for the worst. It would definitely be ideal to just get along and work things out through discussion, but Ainz certainly wasn't going to let himself become complacent. That being the case, the most important thing right now was to increase his war potential. That and gather as much information
as possible, yeah.
Once those two things were complete, it would then be possible to approach every scenario with the utmost caution, giving Ainz the edge he definitely felt he lacked right now. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode's content. I know it's right in the middle of Shield Hero, but Season 2 hasn't really been doing well. Plus, it's also been extremely confusing to follow.
Yeah, it has been,
I'll
Jesus.
definitely go back and finish the power profile on now for me, but if this video does do well, then I'll keep doing Overlord cut content until Season 4 comes out.
I like the little bits of information that we get on these, like the stuff about the mask. I thought that was really cool. I mean, it's not important, but it's still really interesting that it had like certain things that you needed to do to get it within the original game and that. That was cool, I like these, and I can't wait for Season 4 of Overlord. It's going to be so good to have Overlord back. But yeah, thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, links in the description of the Patreon page. $1 a month is all I ask to help support the channel. Greatly appreciated. Thank you guys very much for that. And thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments down below. Let me know what I should watch and discuss in future videos. And I'll see you guys, all you guys, next time.